we got over 50 in now. I think we can get going.
Okay. So just a welcome to everyone. We've got Graeme Hand here from sunny Australia. It's 5 o'clock in the morning, so we had to start pretty early. That's why we're a little bit later tonight. My name's Tim Williams. A few of you will know me from the PFLA as well. So I was, I'll just run through the what's going to happen tonight. So we're going to just have a brief introduction of me and Graeme, and then Graeme's going to run through about how to understand how to regenerate your pasture and look at safe to fail practice areas and what to do now with the low rainfall. Although over the last couple of days we've definitely, that's changed around. So when I first contacted Graeme, we were looking at a drought basically, and so I just asked him to touch on how to manage our way out of a drought, and then we're going to look at where to next. And I have put in here a Q&A, but it'd be good if people ask questions using the Q&A function as we go. Just a little bit about myself. So I came to the farm in 2010, and so I've sort of managed, I grew up on a sheep and beef farm in New Zealand and livestock here in the UK, New Zealand and in Australia as well. And I sort of came in to understand the regenerative farming systems when I was managing Glendew Station, also called Wanaka Organics, and I stumbled upon a guy called Joel Sellerton and also Alan Savory, and read a few of his books. And then when I came to the UK, I sort of helped set up English Farm, which is one of the first certifications certifiers come to the farm, because I distinctly remember going through all the certification process with him and helping to explain it. I think Silas is going to be on the call on the webinar today as well. Last year I was back in New Zealand managing Mungrow Station, and you know, for some people they call that the birthplace of regenerative agriculture in New Zealand. Greg brought Joel to New Zealand when he went to Glendew Station many years ago. So we managed that farm last year. We had about 800 head of cattle running on a completely pasture system. Shifts every animal on a rotation. So I got very heavily involved in the grassland management, and it was just sort of an extension of what we're doing now. And now we're with Anthony Estate down here in Cornwall, where we are looking at transitioning a very sort of intensive agricultural farm. Soil is quite severely damaged, and so we're going to transition that into a based regenerative livestock system, using grazable crops for the first couple of years and then expanding on that. So yeah, I will hand over to Graeme.
All right, thanks Tim, and thanks for having me. Just put my screen up and start from there if that works for you. Yeah, so welcome everyone. Thanks for staying up late, and 5 here, so nice early start. Very cool mornings, frosty, very cold for Australia. So just quickly, I'll just skip through a few things. I manage STIPA, which is the Australian Native Grass Association, sort of as the CEO of it. That's a not-for-profit charity, a member of the Agrarians, and a committee member of the Regenerative Ag Network of Tasmania. just so, yeah, like I'll to keep me on track, I'll just quickly go through a bit of an agenda. So just what's our story, as Tim said, level of change and risk. So I think the change is happening and that risk is increasing. So we'll talk about that and what's happening. I wanted to just briefly talk about complexity, just because what it means in terms of getting advice. I wrote a series for 10 years in the Stiper newsletter called Never Take Advice, and it sort of was formed together when I understood Dave Snowden's work over at Cognitive Edge. Landscape function, sort of what's the measure, what does regenerative mean, and what works in practice. You know, our coaching program, probably skip over that and then Q&A. So I've been doing some grazing, holistic plan grazing since 1990, trained with Alan Savory in 96 in New Mexico, Albuquerque, and up at Cimarroncita. So I'm accredited with the Savory Institute and HMI. The head of HMI is Anne Adams, and I trained with her in 1996. So I've tried to focus on farmer success rather than my success. You know, and that's been really interesting. And in Australia, there's quite a few different trainers with different emphasis, and there's different tribes, I call them, grazing tribes, and different opinions and stuff. And because I had this role that was sort of being able to work across multiple farms, I got to see what people were doing and what the outcomes were from other people's training. So I'm not a practice person, I'm an outcome person. So as long as it's increasing landscape function and biodiversity, it's basically good for the land. Some barriers to adoption, that's with a guy called Doug Mackenzie Moore from Canada. I trained with him, and you know, he had sort of some real insightful breakthroughs on to what are the barriers to adoption. They're never usually what you think they are. And then again, back to complexity with Dave Snowden. My view of the world sort of a little bit different. I'm not interested in all the practices that slow the car down as it heads for the cliff. I'm only interested in the practices that do the handbrake turn and spin it around and drive the other way. So I tend to poo-poo a lot of stuff, but I'll try and put that in context a bit later. That it's not that I don't think that they're important and stuff. It's just that I'm not interested in them because I cannot see any point in going slowly over the cliff. If we're not going to turn around, then I believe we should gun it and see how fast we can go. I put the pedal to the metal and do it. I'm doing a project on this property at the moment. So this is sort of doing some grazing. For me, it's very hilly. I grew up just outside, I farmed outside of the dairy area in southwest Victoria, which was basically really good soils and flat, whereas this is not that. It's in southeast New South Wales, between Canberra and the coast, and it's very hilly, surrounded by national parks. It's got wild dogs and goannas, and it's just completely different. Wombats everywhere. But the point being that even though it's really harsh and hard, that with the right infrastructure, you can regenerate it. So as long as you understand the principles. This is the fencing plan we're working on. It's sort of, we're just chipping away at the moment up in this area. So those cows are on that face there, just there at the moment. So we're seeing how that's going to go in terms of doing that. We do really low cost fencing. It's just labour sort of thing because basically you're working on foot most of the time. So just quickly on that level of change, I'm going to be talking about redesign. This is Professor Stuart Hill's work. So most people, when they think I've got to change, the first thing they think of is efficiency. How do I make this job more efficient, or how do I make that fertilizer more efficient? And it's not deep enough change. It's necessary, and we need to really focus on energy use and all those efficiencies. The next one is substitution. We tend to take a problem and then go, oh, is there something I can do that's less toxic or cheaper or whatever? And I think of that as substitution. So the one I usually use to explain it is if if you're using nitrogen fertilizer, then efficiency is putting coating on the nitrogen fertilizer so it doesn't volatilize. Substitution might be legumes and composted chook manure or something. So I think of it as taking a toxic aspirin for the problem. Shifting from a toxic aspirin, I'm still waking up, shifting from a toxic aspirin to a less toxic aspirin, but you're still using a lot of fossil fuel and doing a lot of work. So I'm not interested there. That's slowly over the cliff. But I'm talking about redesign, where you actually redesign the management so that you don't need to add nitrogen fertilizer. And that's harder to do. It actually, there's a third pathway for nitrogen fertilizer. So it's one that actually doesn't go through mineralization. When I say that to most soil scientists, they just put their head on the side and look at me like a Labrador puppy. Do you know, like sort of, it's like as if they first discovered quantum theory. So we need to know that there is a deeper redesign that we need to make agriculture increasing biodiversity and landscape function. So improving the whole landscape while we produce food and fibre. This guy's had a lot of influence on me, Dr. Tim Hutchins. He retired from farming and as his succession plan, so the boys could take over, he went and did his PhD on farm risk. So he's really important. But the key point out of that is that it's about minimising losses, not maximising production. It's very poorly understood. Everyone's trying to chase production. If anyone's giving you advice and says, I'll be able to increase your production, I'd run away. I would run away. I would not go near them because they will actually result in increasing your losses. So unless you can eliminate the whole, the three key risks in agriculture, which are debt, rainfall and market price, then intensifying actually reduces your profit over time. So when I think about it, I worked for our Department of Agriculture here and things like that. I don't think they ever talked about risk. I don't think they ever talked that it's about profit and not about production. So you need to know that these risks are what strangle. So debt's sort of like it compounds down. So it becomes the tail wagging the dog. Even with low interest rates, it tends to make people make poor decisions. So rainfall's the next, and as we've been talking earlier before it started about sort of had some rain sort of in the last day or two, but generally in Australia we're very practiced at running into these into seasonal droughts. So and I'll talk about the impact that has. So rainfall is the next biggest risk, and then market price. So the really good managers in Australia are keeping low debt. They're actually managing for long recoveries of the perennial grass to link up growing seasons and do all of that sort of work so that they never run out of grass. And then they have very, very low cost of production so that their market price risk is also reduced. So I can talk about those models and stuff if people are interested. So just quickly on complexity, we need to know that you cannot get advice on how to run your farm, which is really good because I work as an advisor. So, but all I'm doing is trying to get people to think about what is it that I need to do myself. And I've been trying to use Dave Snowden's work from Cognitive Edge. His language is incredibly dense and it's really hard to read. So friends that I work with and stuff, I'll start talking to them and they'll go, Peter said to me the other day, I know in 2 months you'll have simplified it enough that I can understand it. So, but he lets me practice on him. So, which it's important. But if there's conflict and contradiction, then it's complex. If it's got people in it, if it's got the environment in it, then it's complex. If you throw in money and social and sort of all that farming. It's incredibly complex. So what I'm trying to do with people is constrain or simplify. So I'm trying to grab that complexity and constrain it enough so that people can see the patterns. The only problem with complexity is if you constrain it too much, if you squash it too much, it'll ooze out between your fingers and it'll all end in tears. So I'll be coming back and trying to say, you need to know what the boundaries are. You need to know what it is that, which areas you can ask for advice and which areas you can't. So this is Dave Snowden's Cynefin, and it's sort of, I think this works for me. So in that bottom right-hand quadrant, it's sort of the obvious area or the clear area, as he now calls it. So if you were in the middle and you were conflicted and you weren't sure which way to jump, you could check whether doing work instructions and putting procedures in place would fix the conflict and the problems, and they might. It's very rarely that it does, but it could be. The other one is that complicated, the top right there. That's where you get your expert views from. So you could go, so I think of that as legal and tax and accountancy, all those type of things, how to set up sort of co-ops, how to do all that work. You can actually go and ask an expert. But if you've got multiple experts, which is what the grazing space has, and they all have different views and different opinions, then it's complex, which means you have to go into that top left and what can you try? What do you need to do? What are the trials or practice areas or whatever it is that you need to do on your farm? So with grazing management, most of the time it comes in here. If it's in chaos, you've just got to act. So, and I thought as the coronavirus swept around the world, it was really interesting to everyone to go into chaos, and some acted and some didn't. I thought that was quite interesting. So the ones that acted, like your fellow countryman, Tim, they acted very quickly and got a grip on it. So she should be running the world. But anyway, that's another story. So if you're conflicted and you don't know what it is, so this has sort of tried to give it a bit more idea. So if it's in the clear area, then it's going to be training and work instructions and procedures. If you need to design a water system, so you've already worked out your paddock plan, but you want to know that you're going to get enough water out the end of the pipe and into the cattle trough or the sheep trough, then you need to know that you've got to use an engineer. This is where you just use process. This is where you use experts. And this is complex, is where you have to do the work yourself and do the safe to fail practice areas. And I just tried to think of an example here as animal health. So landscape function. So this is a monitoring technique of actually assessing the soil surface, which predicts what's happening under the soil. This really is a key piece of information that you need to know. What does the soil surface need to look like so that I know that it's getting better rather than getting worse? I don't like soil pits, so I do drive the soil scientists quite crazy, because the soil health is a lagging indicator of the soil surface management. If nothing else, you need to know that, because most people are giving advice about doing something in the soil when it's actually about managing the soil surface. So this is David Tongway. He was from our research organisation, and he was tasked with at the next rainfall, what will happen. And this is Colin Sides, who I work with a lot. He's also a founding member of Stipa Native Grasses, which was founded in 1997. He's come up with pasture cropping and multi-species pasture cropping, and the pair of us also do work together and bounce off one another, which works really well. This is a simplified version of landscape function, but it's close enough. So the idea is, what do you have to look at to know what's going to happen? So I'll come back to this again and again. So if you want the land to be stable and not eroding, infiltrating water and cycling nutrients, then these are the key things you have to look at. So you have to look at soil cover. I don't for stability. Sorry, I'll go to the next slide. I don't meet a farmer anywhere in the world that doesn't know that erosion is caused by bare ground. Yet when I drive around in the States, in the UK, in Mongolia, you know, like Brazil, you know, it's like as if they don't know. New Zealand, sorry, Tim, I didn't give them a whack on the way through. It's like as if we pretend that we don't know this. So if you want the land to be stable and not eroding, it must be covered. And so it's a combination of annual plants here and litter cover. So litter is actually the leaves from the perennial grass. So I'm going to be talking mainly about perennial pastures. So for stability, you need cover and you need litter cover as well. For water infiltration, it's different. You need large basal area perennial grasses. David Tongway doesn't measure them if they're under 4 square centimetres. So he doesn't count any of the plants that are under that. A lot of properties I go to that are conventionally managed and set stocked or poor short rotations and stuff, the basal cover of the perennial grass, so how much of each hectare is covered with the base of a perennial grass. This is what this is about. Because as that increases, you actually increase water infiltration. Most farms, when you measure them, have less than 10% basal cover. Less than 10% of every hectare is covered with the base of a perennial grass. Where I am at the moment, they came out of the drought, they had some rain, I measured it when I turned up here, and they had 30% or 28%, sorry, I exaggerate. So they had 28% after a sort of a couple of years drought. So immediately they grew enough feed to get through the winter. So whereas others are already feeding that didn't have that. Again, that litter cover comes in. For water infiltration, you've got to have that soil covered, you know, buffering the impact of the raindrops, and some surface roughness. So that was sort of new information to me when I came across David Tongway, that the rougher the surface, the better the infiltration. It makes sense, it's obvious, but I just hadn't put it together. If you want nutrient cycling, then again, it's that basal cover of perennial grass. So they're like massive funnels, those big perennial grasses, for water in, but air in, and then they're feeding and activating the nutrient cycle. The other key one is this degree of decomposition. The litter must be pushed onto the soil surface so that it can be colonized by the beneficial soil organisms and start actively decaying. So the key one there is it deep? Sorry, excuse me. Between the perennial grasses, the large perennial grass bases, do you have decomposing litter? So this is the foundations. This is the actual solid base that we build diversity and production and biodiversity on. So you need to have these going. In a perennial pasture, this is what it is. This is what it looks like. And that's all the combinations. So these, I'll send the notes through to everyone. So you'll have a copy of the slides. So same soil type, different management. So this is under a grass plant, and this is between the grass plants with conventional management. And you don't need someone to sort of tell you what the numbers are to realize that this one's got better stability, better infiltration, and better nutrient cycling. So I haven't got the questions up. I'll keep going. Yell out if there's any, Tim.
Yeah, Graeme, I was just going to ask about that surface roughness. Is that in plants, or that when you go back to that surface roughness, can you just elaborate on that a little?
Yeah, so surface roughness, the way we measure it is we run a transect, and then we select sort of random meters along that transect, and then it's between the highest point and the lowest point on that meter on the transect. And it's really that it needs to be a variation of more than about 8 to 10 millimeters for it to start kicking into the nutrient cycling and the water infiltration. So ideally, it would be from the plants, but you've got to be a bit careful. So people know this. They'll leave, for water infiltration, they'll leave paddocks rough ploughed so that it's actually sort of infiltrating water and holding it. But you've got to be a bit careful. If you're not managing well, you'll get pedestaling of the perennial grasses, and they'll be sitting up on a little, there's a lag in the system. They'll be sitting up on a little pedestal, and you don't want that because that means that you've eroded the soil around each of the perennial grasses. So it's really, you need some. So in Australia, if you couldn't drive the farm vehicle, the ute, across the paddock at 80 kilometres, people would plough it up and re-sow it. When in actual fact, it was adding massively to their water infiltration and nutrient cycling. So I'm sure I'm sure there's some people that recognise that management. So yeah, I'll keep heading on. So what I'm talking about is leaf emergence and perennial grass physiology. So the dairy industry is all over this, but we need to be all over this as well. It's not about the height of the grasses and kilograms of dry matter per hectare. I've done thousands of hours doing that, from using pasture rulers to rising plate meters to all that. It's got nothing at all to do with the height. And the way I've been trying to say it to people is using height for grass recovery is like using height to estimate people's age. And then I go on to say, I'd be 12 and getting younger. So we need to know that it's about the leaf emergence and it's about the perennial grass physiology. The problem with the dairy industry is that they've branded that leaf here, that once that leaf is dying, so this is perennial ryegrass, I'm sure you all know this, that leaf there's branded as waste in the dairy industry, so they never ever produce enough litter to get enough decomposition that they can reduce their fertilizer inputs or use every last gram, I say, of their fertilizer because they've got such a high functioning that. So this is just on the back of the motorbike. So this is some of that litter there. I've got other photos coming up, so just on a phalaris plant. The grasses are ready to be grazed when they've got fresh yellow litter in them. They're not ready to be grazed before that because you cannot build landscape function. And if you don't build landscape function, you don't increase your stability, water infiltration, and nutrient cycling. I've been sort of trying to solve this ever since I got taught by Alan. But I never ever realised that what does a recovered perennial grass plant look like. So I did some work. I was an adjunct associate lecturer at Sydney University, and so we did some work and we measured all this and found that it was actually about increasing landscape function, which means that you have to grow the litter before you graze it to increase the landscape function. So when I'm training now, I say it's not about the animals, it's not about that, it's about building landscape function and lowering the risk by never running out of grass. So in Australia, that tends to be require a lot of good management. So just that definition, looks like an ungrazed plant and contains fresh yellow litter. So Alan Savory always had when it looks like an ungrazed plant, and that means that it's got no cut-off tips, that all those tips now are in the litter because there's that rotation through that of that leaf emergence and the older leaves. So the ones that have had they've been chewed off are now in the base of the litter. So all the plants that you can see have really good tips on them and there's fresh litter. And I've tried to show a really young ryegrass plant, but in theory, it's actually nearly ready to be grazed. It won't build landscape function, but you won't kill it. So depends on temperature and soil moisture, so less on fertility. So it's really something that you've got to monitor. You can't have a guess at this and you can't take advice on it. It's up in the complex domain. It depends on the aspect, on the treatment, it depends on sort of so many things that you've been doing that you've actually got to find out what it is on your place, so on your farm. So this is the cycle for grazing. So the plant's ready to be grazed when it's looks like an ungrazed plant and contains fresh yellow litter. The animals come along and graze it severely, that top middle there. The plant then shifts its root reserves around to start putting up fresh leaf. This is where you'll run into animal health problems. If you're getting animal health problems, metabolic diseases in livestock, scouring in the calves or whatever, it's because the grass is too young. It's not about some bug that's come in from South Africa. Like we had this whole weird thing that the animals were dying because the grass was too young and they were getting metabolic diseases. And all I said was, give them some straw, and they couldn't believe it that fixed them because they thought they had some disease that had come in from South Africa. So it's got nothing to do with that. This is, if you come back and graze this plant, it hasn't replaced its root reserves. The grass is too young. It's got too much non-protein nitrogen in it, and you'll get animal health problems. Happy to work with anyone that's got problems with animal health. It's very easy to fix. It also results in low fertility because the animals, this type of grass ends up with too much blood urea nitrogen, which lowers their fertility. So because of that extra urea in the system, the animals are working so hard, they go into negative energy balance, and mammals don't cycle if they're in negative energy balance. So it's not a mystery. So if you've got problems with fertility, you've got problems with feet, you've got problems with calves or lamb scours, any of those sort of things, it's about the grass being too young. They should smell sweet. And usually when you go on to sort of a lot of properties that the recoveries are too short, it's very sour and very strong in ammonia, because the animals are working so hard to get rid of that. So I always feel like we're killing them with kindness. So in theory, the plant's replaced its root reserves here, and if you came back and grazed it, you wouldn't kill it, but you won't build landscape function. So, and I just say, the purpose of grazing is to build landscape function and biodiversity and resilience. It's not about just keeping the animals alive or going very well. So if you came back here, the leaves are fully regrown, it's got fresh litter in it, you'll actually build landscape function there. So what works in practice? This is what works in practice, is setting up some trials, some practice areas, small areas. You've got to do this at really high stock density just to reduce that variable. I'm not saying you have to manage the whole place like this, but if you do this at high stock density, you know that it wasn't lack of stock density or herd effect or animal impact that's causing it not to germinate. So I get people to run these areas at sort of yard densities for short periods of time, let something grow, and then trample it down like this next slide. You need them to be longer than what you could ever be. You're trying to find the boundaries here. You're not trying to find out what's the optimum. You're trying to find out what would be too long on this property, what would be too short on this property. Niels has sent me some photos and things like that that show that in the UK, the grasses will stay healthy like out at 4 years, even though they're getting a little bit choked. Another key point about grasses is that they can't drop their leaves, so they were designed to be grazed, and eventually they'll choke themselves out, and you'll get less and less better grasses and more of the lower successional grasses in your environment. In Australia, it goes back to bare ground, and that red dirt, that red centre, is all about the grasses dying from underuse, so choking themselves out. So the majority of farms that I go to, they're coming back too frequently and they're overusing, but then there's also the other end of it, which is underusing also kills grasses. So you need some extremely long recoveries, like people like Gabe Brown are doing 14-month recoveries on their grazing. So making sure that they're building litter, checking that they're increasing the fungal content of the soil. So This is about how do you find out what's the recovery that I need. So this is what I say to people: put some of these areas in and just lock them up and watch them. Let them grow up and be old and lots of volume, and then trample them down, but leave the ground covered. Take photos and monitor it, because it'll tell you what sort of things are happening on your land. What you need to catch is, are you in a step shift with this rainfall? So once it's rained, it's like everything's good, but that's not going to be the case. So, you know, you've got to make sure that your recoveries are long enough that you can cope with these little interseasonal droughts, which is what I feel like you've been having in the UK. So just so it's like a drought within the growing season. Typically in this area, they'll have every year, they'll have at least 1 4-week period that they get no rain, and then the whole thing will fall apart. So how's that going, Tim? Did you?
Yeah, there's just a couple of questions here. And this, I think, is quite pertinent in the UK. And I've sort of struggled with it a bit in the past. Is how do you graze sheep on that sort of that high recovery, longer grass?
Yeah. Oh, g'day, Andrew. That's good questions. Yeah. So you've got to graze them at high stock density. Sheep won't be competitive enough. So this is, and Andrew's also said about your view on non-selective grazing, like Johan Zeitsman advocates for UK environment. I don't see anything else work, and I've taken those slides out, but I've got slides, and I might stick one in when I send out the notes from Andre Voisin's book, that he says that sort of non-selective grazing is really all you can do, because the animals will otherwise they walk into a paddock, find the best grass that they can find, and eat it all the way to the ground. So once you know that the animals don't graze like a motor mower and just, you know, you can take them out. So there's a few things that I say differently than the rest of the people on the planet, it seems, apart maybe from Johan Zeitsman and Jaime Elizondo, and on occasions Gabe Brown. You must utilise as high as you can while you're still getting animal performance, and then you must have long recoveries to get the litter back into the system so that you're building landscape function. This is so poorly understood. And every time I hear graze a third, you know, graze a third, leave a third standing and trample a third, I just about pop a hose, because it doesn't work in practice. It fails over time, because when you do that, the animals haven't grazed a third of the best or the better grasses in that paddock. They've eaten that all the way to the ground. They don't graze by height, they graze by the plants they like. And once you understand that, grazing a third is just nonsense. So, sorry, don't want to pop a hose. I'll keep my blood pressure down. But that's what we've got to really be careful about advice, and this is why I keep saying it's that. So, so with long grass, and Andrew, it'd be that make sure that they're at high stock density whenever you put them into those. So. And Niels Caulfield has said he started with a pure weed property. So we've been swapping grasses of photos of grasses and stuff like that. Yeah, so there's another.
Sorry, there was just a question around how you deal with weeds. I said weeds are just misplaced plants, and usually they're trying to tell you something. You might want to elaborate on that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I often get asked to sit on, you know, those little panels at the end of a presentation day and stuff like that. And then they'll start saying, oh, what do you think about weeds as indicator species? And I try and disappear. Like I try and pretend that I'm not there. So, because I go, oh, it's me, because it's everyone. The problem is, because I used to say, yeah, weeds are an indicator. They're an indicator you can't manage. But now I've switched that to actually explaining what I mean. And what I say is, if you have annual forbs and weeds, those sort of thistles and any of those soft forby type annuals and things like that, it's because the recovery is too short. There is no other way of grazing those things if you haven't been in there, of growing those things. If you haven't been in there and scraped it with a machine or done something like that, the only thing it can be is recovery too short. So in a perennial grass system, we need to reframe the way we think about weeds. The problem is not too much weed. The problem is not enough grass. So what can you do to grow grass? So with really, we have problems with grasses like African lovegrass and serrated tussock and stuff in Australia. And all I do is make sure that I focus on the between the weeds and grow really good grasses there using long recoveries and stock densities and high utilisation. And then by growing those grasses within that weedy grass, it eventually pushes the weedy grass out. So all the forbs and thistles and stuff, this is where I came into Alan's work, was all I wanted to do was get rid of the thistles. And that's what drove me through all this, was that I realized it was bigger than that, but the weeds were such a minor problem that they'll actually fall out of the system. So it's out competing them with higher successional, better perennial grasses, not trying to kill the weed. So I've got some photos up further just to show how we do that. I'll put this in the notes. But really, it's sort of, you need to know how to estimate landscape function. So this is about what's happening at the soil surface, what's the condition of the soil surface, what's happening on the soil surface, what's the name of the nearest perennial grass. So is there a range of seedlings, young and mature grasses, and what's happening with the basal area. So I'll put that in the notes. It's sort of a bit of a project in itself to understand that, but have you got fungal decomposition or slight decomposition? I've tried to color code it, so red is dying, yellow at risk, green recovering, blue regenerating. So this is what decomposing litter looks like. So that's decomposing litter on the left there. So raw litter sort of just is sort of in Australia's grey and oxidising. Yours takes a lot longer to go grey and oxidising just because you're in a far less brittle environment. But this is what we're trying to do, compost in situ over the whole landscape. So so what works in practice? I'll get back on track. So this is some of the monitoring stuff that we can go through and things. But so these are the steps in planned grazing. Determine the recovery required for your land. It can't be an estimation from an advisor. You've got to do the safe to fail practice areas. So what is it? And it's not just when the grasses are recovered. It's also that you've got a buffer in the system to allow you to adjust your stocking rate when you have variation in your rainfall. So the people that are going really well in Australia have all these systems set up where they have every ewe on the place. So like for the sheep guys, they'll have every ewe individually ID'd, and they'll have them on a league ladder from the most profitable to the least profitable. And as soon as they have one of these sort of very lower rainfall times, they then get rid of the least profitable. So the average profit of the flock. So this is like Johann Zeitzman's selecting for the animals that perform on your land. And he describes that selection really well in Man, Cattle and Veld, his book. So what's the actual recovery? So when I turn up at someone's place, I go, what recovery do you need? And they go, I think it's 90 days. And I go, oh, well, okay, show me. So I want to go and look at something that tells me that that's right. And invariably they go, oh no, I've got nothing to show you. I just think that. And I go, well, we can't just think, we've actually got to know this. So in the complex domain, it's about sort of trying to explore the unknown by actually doing the trials and working it out. You then plan recovery and grazing time in each paddock. using that evidence and data that you've gathered from your own trials, and then we make sure they're in the right paddock at the right time and continually monitoring to make sure the plant is continually put back on track. So there's some simple formulas and stuff, but this will be in the notes. So what's the average paddock size? What's the average grazing time? So it's that recovery period that you've determined and then divided by the number of paddocks -1. The -1 is only because that paddock they're in isn't recovering. So it's pretty simple stuff. Here's an example sort of that I use because it's sort of simple enough that people can understand it. So you've got 11 paddocks. You're planning for 180 days recovery. It's 110 hectares. So the average paddock size is 10 hectares. The average grazing time is 18 days in each paddock. So that's what you would do and start with before you did any subdivision. You'd actually make sure you were getting the average grazing time in each of those paddocks. But because our paddocks aren't the same quality and same size, we need to do a bit of estimation. I used to do this mathematically, and I find that estimation's equally as accurate and much simpler to do. So paddock number 1 there, it's average size, average quality, so it gets 18 days as we calculated. The next paddock's 15 hectares and average quality, so it gets another 50% and it's 27 days. Paddock 3 is small but good, so it gets more than its share. So you're trying to evenly share the grazing days over the whole farm. So now you know how many days you need to be in each of those paddocks. So then you can put animals into that area, and if they don't get 18 days and you're not getting your gut fills and dung scores and animal performance, then you know you have too many animals. So I don't change my recovery based on growth rate. I change my recovery on, am I getting enough? I change my stocking rate to make sure that I always get the recovery that I've identified from my trial areas. Well, it's hard at 5:49. So it's that sort of thinking. The brake and the accelerator is the stocking rate. So it means the enterprise, to be regenerative, must be designed to make it easy to adjust your stocking rate up and down. So I tend to get people to worry about going down rather than worrying about going up. I find that that's not a problem for people. They can usually work out other ways of getting stock into the system, less so with the sheep people, but then they use cattle and, it's that sort of thing. And others that like coming out of the drought and all animals are too expensive. So then we're doing pasture cropping and looking at ways of other alternative ways of doing that. So being aware all the time that we've got to be reducing our debt, our rainfall risk and our market price risk. So farming fails because it's too risky and it's too expensive. So every enterprise change, every new enterprise must lower expenses and must lower risk. And I do a whole series on identifying those things. So then what is happening during this time? So this is the scheduling. I'm just sort of aware of how long I'm going on for. So just plan backwards from the most critical activity. So you need to have a bit of a calendar of what's happening. So this was just sort of from our place down in Southwest Victoria. So growth was from April to March to December. When we calved just at the start of the growing, joined there, which wasn't ideal because it was just after the shortest day and all that sort of stuff. So, and then when we were selling and when we were having holidays, because that changed the way we managed. And then just quickly, the monitoring, just for this animal health, we use the early warning. We want the leading indicators, not the lagging indicators. Everyone's going for lagging indicators. And the way that that group I'm in Tasmania, they go, "Oh, Graeme, we don't understand what you mean." I said, I love earthworms, but they're a lagging indicator of decomposing litter on the soil surface. So I don't look at earthworms. I look at, is there decomposing litter, knowing that that creates the conditions for the earthworms. So the earthworms are a lagging indicator of how you're managing the soil surface. so early warning, daily monitoring and annual monitoring. So we used gut fill on the left-hand side of the animals to do, have they had enough to eat? I shift them when they're about 20% at this score, where you can just see this triangle here, the paralumbar fossa, when about 20% of them are showing that. And that worked well for our place. They were mainly winter growing grasses, C3 grasses on pretty fertile soils. To get the same animal performance where I am now, we have to go for slightly higher gut fill scores so that we can actually get the animal performance. But once you've got a measuring tool, then you can work out very easily and quickly, well, what gut fill score works for me. We then also, this is the Dung Score, which tells you how young the feed is. So this is where you get animal health problems. The feed's moving too fast through the rumen. So this cow here would be about a 2. And you get that way that you can assess the rump as well as on the ground. There's always a range. This is supposed to be a nice pie with a dip in the middle, but the photos got mixed up in the process somehow. Yeah, so here, too fibrous, too old. Here, too young, too fast. This is animal health. This gives good animal health, but lower animal performance. So, and the same with sheep. This sheep's actually lower than score 1. I'm not a great sheep guy, but you know, like it's usually, I just say to people, what, you know, towards the end of spring in Australia, when the grasses have hardened up, what do the dung scores look like? You're trying to do that all the time, all year round. So the dairy industry has a lot of this sort of stuff, DeLaval and stuff. So then just quickly, this is sort of, I worked for Meat Standards Australia, so this is the Australian beef grading, and I think it's crucial. I went and worked on it because I wanted to make sure that they included grass-feds, because when it started, it was all about grain-fed meat. And what we found was that with the grass-feds, at the same carcass end point, you could actually get more flavour and a better mouthfeel. And also, there's not that that grain-fed fat. I think sizzle plates were designed. Do you have sizzle plates? Like, you know, like trying to keep this meat hot, because the grain-fed, the melting point of the fat out of grain-feds is much higher than it is in grass-feds. So grass-feds, you'll see people eat them all the way through because the fat hasn't hardened up like it does in a grain-fed. And with in a grain fed. So with the grain feds, what you actually see is that people will leave the steak because as it got cold, the fat hardened up in it. So people tend to finish a grass-fed steak, but they won't finish a grain-fed steak. And it's to do with the melting point of the fat and stuff. So this is just quickly. This is just sort of if you get the animals to the abattoir with enough energy in them, and they go into rigor mortis at the right temperature. There's a pH window of between 25 and 30 degrees C when they go into rigor mortis. Then once you've done that, you can then measure, which is a big thing, making sure that you get them to the abattoir. So they've got to come up, be on a rising plane of nutrition. And then to get into the commercial system, they've then got to be trucked properly, handled well, not socially mixed at the abattoir, at the lairage, so you don't mix other groups of animals. So I usually tell a story about, like, it's all right for Tim every Friday night he fights at the pub, but I don't, so it stresses me. So even though he's the noisy one, he's the noisy fighting one, he's not stressed because this is normal for him. So you have to do all that behavioural thing, but we can't mix those animals up. And then we can just do, so you can measure the same thing. So this is very familiar to me when I came across landscape function, because I'd been doing this with the grazing system. What do you have to measure so that you can predict the eating qualities? So it's, you know, with you measure the basal area and litter and things on the land. With this is what you have to measure. So we did sort of several 100,000 taste tests, and after a while the patterns fell out. So we were using dentition for eating quality, and it's got very little to do with eating quality. It's very low relationship. It's actually got more to do with ossification of the spine. So we went to using this one here, the ossification of the spine. So if I just do that as an example, as you change, depending on how hard the animal's been run and how old it is, so it's not just their calendar age, depends on how much you're getting conversion of cartilage to bone in the spine. So this one here's got an ossification of 200, and just without my notes, that'd mean that the sacral vertebrae were all fused, and you had a lot of fusing in the lumbar vertebra, but still unfused in the thoracic vertebra. So it's about that sort of how much marbling, what's the rib fat, but this says nothing about whether it was grain fed or not. So if I quickly go through it, so it was a British bred animal, no Bos indicus content, it was a male, no hormone growth promotants, that knocks the eating quality down. It wasn't a milk-fed vealer. That actually knocks the eating quality up if it's still off mum and getting milk off mum. Didn't go through the sale yards. Going through the sale yards lowers the eating quality. It hadn't been flushed. We had got that going on in Australia, which is just some sort of weird thing we're doing. The hot standard carcass weight, 280 kilos, hung by the Achilles tendon, didn't have any hump or 4 millimeters of hump. Had 200 ossification, so that fusion into the lumbar vertebra. It had moderate amount of marbling, not a lot, which is what we see a lot in grass feds. And then it was quite fat, had rib fat of 10, and it had the right pH, and it was aged for 14 days. You change any of those, and it changes this. So this is the cooking method: grill, roast, stir fry, thin slice, slow cook, and corn. And that's by the muscles and the different cuts. So I haven't got the live version in the presentation, but off this animal, if we look at the rump, it had eaten a 51, so just over sort of a pass as a steak. A lot of farmers love a rump steak, but generally they're a bit dodgy for eating. If you roasted it, it'd eat at a 60, which would be white tablecloth quality. So you need to know what these numbers are. It's very easy to train people if you've got graded meat to then train them to be expert eaters. I always think that, winemakers have got an expert palate. They drink wine at a higher level than the average population, whereas a lot of meat producers that I've worked with, and this doesn't win many friends, they actually like meat that's quite tough, more so than the general public. So I was up in Queensland, and where they have a lot of Brahman cross Bos indicus content, which sort of tends to be tougher and chewier. And they said to me, one of the guys said, "I've never had a tough steak," and I just said, "Oh, I can't help you, mate." So if you've never known that there's any variation, then you can't work out this. So that's just a quick scan of that idea. It's on if you Google Meat Standards Australia, it's got all the how it's developed, why it was developed, and all that. We used to get 50% of all meat on the eastern seaboard of Australia failed people's expectations. And the farmers would go, "Oh, you shouldn't be saying that." And I'd go, "Well, I don't." And they'd say, "I think you're wrong, Graeme." So I'd say, "Have you ever been out to a pub or a club and had a ripper steak and then invited all your mates and come back the next time and it's been terrible?" And everyone in Australia has done that. I would imagine it's pretty similar around the world. And I'd go, "Well, one good one, one bad one, that's 50% failure rate." And that was what we got from the taste panels. And we can get the failure rate down below 10% with this, which most people forgive you if you've got your own branded product. And I've worked a lot with people with branded product. I won't do anything. I have a coaching program and a website and stuff, but I won't do any of that and skip straight through to the questions. Just before I do go to the questions, I believe we need to start thinking about, if you're going to change something, how do you make sure that you pick the lowest cost, lowest risk, most profitable action or enterprise? And then if that doesn't work, you escalate. So if you've got a problem weed thing, then it's about grazing management. So start on the bottom step. Don't start halfway up, sort of. agribusiness is always trying to push us up into here somewhere, and it may not be necessary. Multi-species cover crops are great, but they're high risk and high cost, and hardly anyone makes money out of them. So this is like that foragey mixed crop for grazing. And I keep saying you can't cover crop your way into profitability with a grazing enterprise. It's actually got to be perennial grass based. And I'd say start here and then escalate as you go. So sorry, Tim, I've gone on a bit long. Hope that's all right.
No, that's great. Just going back to the meat quality, there was someone touched on the thistle point. A warmer meat, once called, is a very interesting selling point. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, and I get people to do taste tests and work this out for themselves, but if you've got to simplify it. So you've only got 2 pieces of steak. You can't do it. I used to want to do a range, like, and give them 5, and then people couldn't actually get it. So you have 1 grass-fed versus 1 grain-fed steak. And all I do is cut it up into little squares with a toothpick and get them to eat it and have a form in front of them to score it for tenderness, juiciness, and flavour and overall liking, which is, if you Google this is what we did with the taste panels. It's quite interesting that if you do that, and it's very, before they've had a beer or a wine or whatever, and you're just doing this at the start of lunch or something, or the early evening, I found that they could actually pick up from the fat on the grain fed, they could pick up the rancid undertones. And when I was doing it, the reason I was talking about that, there was winemakers there, and they're going, oh, because immediately their expert palates were picking up these rancid undertones of the grain-fed fat. So the melting point of grain-fed is much higher than grass-fed. So at the same temperature, when we always did grass-feds in southern Victoria, and then we started killing grain-feds, and all the boners and slices and that all went out with sore arms, with repetitive strain injury, because the fat on the grain-feds was set so much harder than on the grass-feds that their arms were only used to doing grass-feds. So the Queenslanders came down, and I'm saying, because this was when, before the Brazilians had it, this was Australian Meat Holdings, and I just said to them, well, what do you do up there? Like, we're just losing people, all over the place, because I had a job working as the QA manager for an export abattoir, and just to keep myself on something different, the attention span of an amoeba, I say. So so what they do is they chill them down to get their deep butt meat temperatures, and then they have heaters in the chillers to warm up the subcutaneous of fat so that they can actually cut it. So once you know that there's a difference in this, and it's because it's more, because the fat's sort of more cross-linked and things like that, it's actually harder, and it's less good for our bodies as well. It's harder for our bodies to move it around. So then when people are eating it, do you have sizzle plates in the UK? Do you know, like, you bring it out in the restaurant or the pub or the club on a hot metal plate, like it's a cast iron plate? I don't know whether you do or not. I can't remember.
Yeah, I've seen it before.
Yeah,
not in the UK.
I did have 7 years in London, so working for a chemical company. And that's to try and keep it warm so that fat doesn't harden up or congeal. So because it becomes unpalatable once it has. So, so you can actually, you can eat more of a cold steak than you can, cold grass-fed steak than you can of a cold grain-fed steak. So I'd be looking at some of that, but you need to know where this meat comes from. So if you go into your supermarkets, and there's a pretty fair bet that's going to be grain finished, and then compare one sort of as similar weight, similar size to what you're doing with your grass fed. And
pretty much 100% of them.
Yeah, people love it. Yeah.
Um, so just moving on to a few of the other questions. So over here, there's a lot of winter housing, and that's sort of, this sort of system, does it allow for that conservation of forage? Some guys will some farmers will put their animals in for 6 months of the year, so they have to conserve a lot of silage. How do you get around that with this sort of system?
Yeah, I don't think of it as a system. I think of it just as what the land needs. So we need to know that I'm not trying to compete with advice from other people that are providing systems and stuff. This is what the land needs. So, so it's about matching the stocking rate to the carrying capacity of the land that you're not conserving. That's all. So before you'd had that rain, I was going to do a bit of a session on, I would walk around. So if I got called into someone that was struggling in drought in the UK, I would walk around and try and find plantations and locked up areas to try and estimate what is the recovery required in here, because it's an immediate problem. You don't have time to do your safe to fail practice areas. So I would go and sort of estimate that and go, it appears that you've got this, you need this longer recovery, whatever it is, because these plants have got enough litter in them from where you haven't grazed them. And then you would go and put that into a grazing plan. Then you'd work out how many days in the paddocks that you've got available. So it's only the available paddocks. We just drop those ones that we're conserving off the list because you can't graze them because you're conserving them. And then after you've cut them for hay, you've got to wait until they're recovered. Most damage from cutting hay is actually from coming back onto the pastures when they're too young and haven't recovered, rather than a lot of the potassium and other issues and stuff. But anyway, and I would would have done that. So you've really just got to work out what's the recovery I need from evidence on your place. Then it's got to have a buffer in it so that you've got time to adjust your stocking rate. So it's more about how quickly you react than the actual recovery of the plants. So in Australia, it'll stop raining and people will go, oh, I think it's stopped raining. I'll wait. And they usually wait about 4 weeks. Oh, yes, it has stopped raining. Oh, I better check. Well, there's usually a month gone by the time they've realised it stopped raining, and then they check for another month, and then they start selling, and they can take a fortnight to do that. So you need to know that you've got to build a buffer in of 60 days on top of what your recovery of the grass is. So you need to work out how quick you can react in your design so that you can actually get out of it quite quickly. So so we just allocate those paddocks. They wouldn't be on that form that I worked out, showed before with the 11 paddocks and the 180 days and 110 hectares. So you just fill out a form with that, with the paddocks that you do have available. It only really works for people if they have one mob, and sheep producers hate sort of only having one mob. Cattle producers are pretty good now at putting all their cows together, but when I'm going around to the sheep properties, they go, oh, these are the red taggers and these are the blue taggers. So they've got they've got sort of 30 mobs, and that's never going to work. You've got to have one mob of ewes, and then maybe some lambs and young stock. And my cheekiness always comes out because I say, oh, what's this mob? Is this the left-handed mob? Because I thought they might have been selecting for left-handed and right-handed sheep to find another mob. But I was just going to quickly, Tim, how are the questions going? I was just going to quickly, this is what we took over in 2002. So it was either bare ground or it was all weedy. It had been cropped and not re-sown. And it'd come back, this is Cape weed and thistles over here. And then within 15 months, we had clear runoff. We use this satellite data for ground cover, and you can see whenever I muck up, because there's nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. We went into drought in 2006, 2007, but because I had reasonable recoveries, we went all right. And when it rained and the drought broke with 100 mil in January, this was 20th of January, the water was clear, and we grew grass like this. So I quite like this look. It's got some leftover grass. I was working for the Department of Agriculture and they thought that it looked terrible. They called it rank and feral, or I think you might, I picked up from Niels, you call it overstood. Yeah, so they'd call it rank, feral, not available for the animals. And they said, what's the palatability of that? And that was when this was what they were advising. And I said the palatability was a lot higher than dirt, so, which was basically what everyone else had. So, questions?
Yeah, there's one, and this one's quite interesting, especially for the UK. It's about if you're mob stocking, and in the UK, mob sizes are a lot smaller. Do you ever worry about reducing the space you'll have in terms of upsetting their natural behaviours? And that's saying, like, if you're running a mob of 30 cattle and you want to really lengthen that rotation or sort of really intensify that mob stocking, you know, is there a point at which you've got to understand that animal needs a freedom as well?
Yeah, not really. They love being together. We always think it's funny because other people are trying to. Let me see. I missed it. Oh, I put up the top, didn't I? The here, this one. These animals don't have a back fence, so there is no back fence in here. So the water is, let me get my laser pointer. The water's here. So I've had this before. They go, oh, it's cruel. You're making them stand in their own dung and things like that. They don't do any of that. They love being together. You know, the neighbours used to ring me and say, oh, I think your cattle have got out. There's black cattle out in the blue gum plantation. And I'd say, oh, and I'd look out the window. If I could see a few of our cows, I knew that all of the cows were there. I didn't even have to go and check. I'd just say, oh, they're the neighbours, they're not mine. Because our cows will not be separate. They love being together. They feel safe. They feel, you know, like they're a herding animal. And what I've found is that this is one of those things that once you understand it, they love to be there. There is no back fence. So that's where they're going to be fed, and then they can go back and lounge separately if they want and do all their natural behaviours and things like that. So there is no problems. I work with people that have got sort of 2,500 beef cows in a herd, and the animals love to get together. If you pull them up and put them in a separate paddock, they'll climb the fences to get back to the mob. They actually want to be. They're a herding animal. I feel like we've bred the herding instinct out of them. So as you change to this management, animals are going to fall out that you're going to have to sell. So they're ones that aren't socially adapted to this sort of thing. So it's like taking me out of Australia and popping me in London. It took me a fair while to adjust. I couldn't cope with people leaning on me in the pub. We do not touch one another in the pub. You know, like so, and people would be leaning on my back, and I'd be trying to get out of it. But within 6 months, you just know everyone's rubbing up against one another. You don't mind it. So, but do you know what I mean? So if those animals don't suit, you get rid of the animals. The biggest blockage, one of the biggest barriers that I see is that people aren't changing the phenotype of their animals. So there's some really good work. This is this work on barriers to adoption. Sorry for scrolling. Barriers to adoption that Doug Mackenzie Moore does. And so these are the barriers, and this is what you do to adjust this. So when I started with all this, I thought it was lack of motivation from the farmers, and you know, we'd focus in holistic management on the holistic context and getting them ownership and making a commitment and all that sort of stuff. And in actual fact, it's probably a little bit of knowledge, but then not having the right infrastructure to make the grazing work. So you need a hell of a lot of paddocks. Anyone that's read Johan Zeitsman's book, he says that 1,000 paddocks or 1,000 sub paddocks per that. So we just strip graze so that the animals are always moving on that. So the water's at the back. We don't worry about back fencing them. We let them walk back to the water. We're not trying to only eat the top third. We're trying to eat it as hard as we can. So therefore they won't go back onto that. that land anyway because it's all been eaten. So there's no reason for them to be back there. So if they're back there, we shift them forward. So sorry. So just this sort of setup. So we have the water at one end, 10, then we just strip up those strips. But we're stripping up within those strips with the recovery and that stock density. So we're trying to hit over that 1,000 cows a hectare stock density, and we're doing really long recoveries because we know that that'll allow us to skip over the drought and never run out of grass. So all we do is then, all we do then is just move them up that strip. When they get to the end of that strip, just call them back and start them in the next strip with the water, and the water can be in a lane down here. So the water's along here. With Peter, he's got water nearly everywhere. So
there's a couple of questions
hectares. Yeah, sure.
Around shade and shelter, and yeah, so they're talking about how the UK weather can be quite intense within one day. And do you feel that there's a health issue with the lack of shade or shelter when you're mob grazing?
No, generally not. But what we would do is, so we in Southwest Victoria, we'd get that run of sort of a week of over 35 degrees, so like stinking hot fire weather, you know. And all we'd do is we'd be saving an area that had trees in it until those weathers. So we would then strategically use the shade. But in general, you know, like they sort of run from Mongolia to Brazil, you know, like, and if you've got adapted animals, it's really not an issue. So you've got to get animals that suit your management rather than change your management to suit your current animals. So that's one of the biggest barriers to adoption. So, and I think that, yeah, getting that structural barriers and then selecting the animals that perform. This is that guy that's got the 2,500 cows in one mob. Yeah, so I just thought I'd do that. So so we don't see an upper limit. I've heard of other people with 8,000 cows in a mob, and they love it. It's like that, but they've got to be socially adapted. They've got to know that they can't go and hide their calf. They know, yeah, they've got to be able to fit in. They've got to also, when you're moving them frequently like that, especially on this really steep ground, I find that you can't have grumpies because you can't move quick enough. It's that steep and it's sort of that rough. You cannot run away from anyone or skip out the way. And so we actually select for good temperament. They've got to enjoy doing this. They've got to perform. They've got to get back in calf. They've got to do all those things, find the water when it's in different spots. And if they don't do that, then you get rid of them because they don't suit what you're trying to do. So.
Fair enough.
All right.
Fair enough. And one from Niels, thanks Niels. If your animals don't like the forage offered, how do you achieve that non-selective graze?
Yeah, so this is a bit like, so, you know, I manage the Native Grass Association in Australia, and the typical answer will be they don't like native grasses, Graeme. And, you know, so the sheep don't like the native grasses. And I go, do you feed them grain? And they go, yes. And I go, do you wean them onto the grain? Yes. And I go, if you can wean them onto grain, something that they're not designed to eat, then you can wean them onto native grass. So really, it's about management. If you came off sort of like young perennial ryegrass and tried to put them onto high fibre, their rumens are going to be in the wrong spot and they will not be able to process it. This has a real impact. As the grass is drying off, we try and eat the driest grass first and then go down and eat the younger grass later. Because I don't know what a docken is. Yeah, so it's that sort of management and understanding the condition of the rumen. And people will have seen this with horses. If their guts are in the wrong spot, they will not eat it. But it's not that it's unpalatable, it's just their guts are in the wrong spot. So, yeah, like there's a lot of people in Australia think that, that animals won't eat kikuyu. And sort of, I can tell you if they're on really rough, fully recovered grass, then they run at the kaiku. So it's about that more than it is about sort of the palatability of that. So that's dung scores early and late in the season. So I always try and do, it's about the grass age. So the way they're handling it, where they have cold winters in the US and Canada, is that they'll have saved some paddocks from that haven't been grazed and have got older feed from the growing season before. So we're always trying to, as we're running out and the new growth's coming through, we've got the new growth coming through before we've run out of the grass from the last season. So the hardest one for us is spring. We grow 60% of our grass from the last week of September to the first week of November. It just explodes through that October, as long as we get rain. So you've got to make sure that you keeping the dung scores and whatever you can. If the animals are suffering from animal health issues, then we start giving them straw or hay or whatever. Yeah, and Johans eats man, cattle and bells.
I think at dock, and it's quite like a dock, but far worse, especially up in Scotland.
Oh, right. Yeah, it would. So it's solving the riddle of recovery, stock density, and utilisation of the grasses. So that they're all sort of variable across the planet and across your farm and things like that. So all you're doing is going, so I'd have to have a look at what the docking was, but that's pretty easy to do if it's an annual forby thing. If it's created from coming back too frequently, then it's easy. The harder one is if you're not getting enough stock density and the land's shifting to woody weeds or trees. I use that term interchangeably. So if it's shifting to woody plants, that's telling you that the stock density that you're grazing at's too low. If it's shifting to annual forby, thistly sort of type plants, then the recoveries are too short. They're quite separate, different things. So I hate sort of woody weeds coming in because it takes a lot of work and energy to get them out. So I'd rather be doing that. So if you have suckless breeding cows, how do you put the dry cows due to calve on a diet if needed and retain the mob grazing principle? What we do with those cows to sort of is we actually make them work. We might push their dung score, their gut fill scores down a bit, but this is again that link back to thing. We want lots of fat, so you really got to make them work on the land. Really likes recovered grass that's high in fibre, lower in protein and energy. And if you've got animals that are prone to getting fat, that's what you want. So you're putting them on older grass, and they'll have really healthy rumens. One of the big things, the big problems I see is that people get their heifers or their cows too fat, and they put them on a diet, and they almost starve them into calving in Australia, and then they've got no energy to push anyway. And it's almost like this thing that it's self-fulfilling prophecy. They go, oh, they're too fat, they'll struggle to calve, so they starve them, so they've got no energy, and then they struggle to calve. And I go, well, you know, if they're too fat, you've got to maintain that. They need lots of energy to calve. And so what we do is make sure that we don't put any more fat on them, but we won't worry about taking that fat off, because we want them to be high in energy when they do start calving, so that they'll keep pushing. And I'd be asking what was the management that made them too fat, and determine what that is and don't. Yeah, so Bill, with the noisy ones, what I do is, if they're noisy and stressed, and I got this from Bud Williams, the cow whisperer guy that's dead now from the States, was I just take them for a walk around in the paddock. So they'll follow me around on they'll definitely train you that they want to move. but you've got to go on the gut fills and the dung scores. So if their gut fills are good, then I'd walk them around in the paddock that they're in until they get sick of me. So typically what I do is I just slowly ride the motorbike around until they got, oh, well, he's not going to let us out. So to stop them and relax them and get them back eating again. I see that, so I see that more as a problem of the wrong animals rather than that the grass is too old. I tend to vary a fair bit from Johann Zietsman and the others about this. So he's trying to make that high octane grass in those summer growing areas palatable, whereas we're trying to make sure that, sorry, Niels, the question is, in a non-brittle environment, the UK, e.g. the UK, do you think recovery periods can be too long, even if planning for the inevitable drought? That is, the pasture is beyond nutrient value and palatability, even if then going into pasture with very high density grazing. I don't think you can, and I think we're missing something here. I think we've got a one-dimensional view of grasses that they, you know, people draw that sigmoid curve and, you know, they grow fast and then they start to senesce. But what happens is that it actually then the next sigmoid curve comes through and the next generation of plants. And I think we need to think about this more three-dimensionally than the single dimension. Oh, I planted this grass and now I want to eat it at the best time. And yeah, like you want to be germinating and establishing plants with your management. And that's what that high stock density does. If it gets high enough, the stock density will germinate the viable soil seed bank. We've never seen lack of seed as a problem in Australia. And like, you know, some of it is incredibly desertified, but it's never lack of seed. It's always lack of management. So this is about management. So I would put in safe to fail practice areas, and I would look at some of those that Niels has, that photos of 4-year-old cocksfoot, and put animals in there. And I can guarantee you they will eat it. They will think it's Christmas. It's like as if it's higher in whatever it's higher in, but it's not higher in fiber. Sorry, it is higher in fiber. It's not higher in protein and energy. It'll be higher in minerals. They seem to be satiated much earlier, but you've got to select the animals that perform on the land that's regenerating. When you go and look back, we've always modified the land for the animals. We're now going back and saying, let's select animals that will actually improve the land. So it's going to be animals that have lower milk, positive fat, lower maintenance energy. A lot of the Angus bulls in the States, you can get their cow energy value. If you're doing cows, I'd definitely look up cow energy value in the States and start looking at, well, what was the original sire of some of these animals, and oh, okay, that fits because it lines up perfectly. Yeah, and I'd agree with James. Sort of, we trying to leave the calves on for 10 months. All the people that are doing regenerative ag that are doing a really good job, leaving them on longer. And with the lambs, because you're then typically when they wean the lambs, they'll put them into smaller mobs and socialize them into bigger mobs as they go. So I'm thinking of people like Norman Pip Smith up near Wellington in New South Wales, and what they do is that, yeah, they might put them in 500s, and when they've got used to that, then they'll put them into 1,000. So that then, yeah, but like once they learn to socialize and stuff, so they're leaving their lambs on, or he was leaving his lambs on to make sure that they were more socially adept and could look after themselves. So yeah, just wean later and work the cows. So you actually want, you know, and there's some good research showing that you get longer life out of the calves, if the heifer calves, if they've been on mum for longer.
Yeah, Graeme, I've got a question. So
Yeah.
how would you manage your weight out of a very low residual? So say you've just kind of been through a drought per se, and you know, your covers around sort of 1,600, maybe even lower, 1,200. How do you build those covers back up to a respectable level?
Yeah, so it's, yeah, you're breaking your accelerators, your stopping rate, and for some reason we are loath to sell animals, but it's about the overall picture. So I don't like the word balance, but it's about, you want the land to be regenerating, but it may not be this year if you've mucked up and you've run out and got low residuals, because that's sort of saying that you didn't react earlier, so you don't want to do that again next time. So you need to make sure that you've got those systems in place, that you're not going to do it. And then I'd be saying, well, the evidence is that I need this longer recovery to start building those residuals. What does that mean in terms of my stocking rate? I'd do that table with the that I showed earlier, and sort of do that grazing plan, and then say, oh well, what does that mean in terms of, do I sell, do I feed? I used to do this thing where I'd say, oh yeah, give me 5 options. Yeah, you could sell them, or you could adjust them, or just putting on paying someone else for them to hold them. And then, like I try and get people to come up with 5 options, so they thought of new things. And now I just say, well, if you're overstocked, which is basically what you're saying, then you've just got to sell. Like I go now, then I went to sell every second option, and now I say all the options are sell, because it's usually the lowest cost, lowest risk thing. We've had a lot of experience with this. The people that are more experienced with drought, they just move incredibly quickly. And if it does rain, they don't get upset. They just go, fantastic, now I've got the options. If you run out of grass, you run out of options. So you either got to sell them cheap or buy feed or whatever it is. It's going to cost you money. And I keep saying that if you run out of grass, you run out of options, and then someone else will grab you by the options and squeeze. So you've got to get out of them, and you've got to have a system. So that's why that league ladder, that profitability, and because we're going to sort of auto drafters with the RFID tag in them, so that they actually, it's like as if the computer sold them rather than the farmer sold them. And so they know that their profitability is going to go up, the average profitability of the mob goes up, and and it's doing it on data, and they're quite happy to take that bottom 20% out. So it's about those things, Tim. I'd be putting a plan in place. If you wanted to send me, so you need to know that you've got one mob running on one group of paddocks. So if you wanted to send me the paddock size and are they good, poor, or average quality, I'd be happy to crunch some numbers. If you said, oh, I think it's going to take me, so if it's just range, you're going to grow 100 kilos a day. If it's sunny, 30 kilos a day, maybe when it's not. So on average, I think Neil sent stuff to me, you're growing at 40 kilos a day, but you've got to be looking at your leaf emergence rate. So I'd say that's probably still going to be long. So, so it's working out all those things and then adjusting from there.
Good answer. Perfect. It's not for me. Unfortunately, I'm not farming at the moment. I don't really get to start until October. But I'm sure there's many people out there that have very, very tight residuals at the moment and are transitioning to this sort of type of management. And after the spring, after the winter we've just had, and then the spring we've just had, there'll be a lot of people scratching their heads in terms of how to build those covers.
Sure.
Good.
Nice people written hand. How are we going? This is just another photo I had of sort of this is where I am sort of at the moment on this property, and these animals here are all there because they're trying to get grass and trying to get fed. And I try and show to people is that was their natural behaviour when they were sort of in these mobs, that they actually moved like that. They actually enjoy that, and we've sort of tried to breed it out of them. This is out of David Attenborough's Great Plains video, Planet Earth 2. Yeah, there it is. Planet Earth 2, episode 7. And at that front, this is all of them trying to get fed, and that's that stock density that regenerates the grasslands, germinates the perennial grass seed bank. So I'm saying all we're doing is really mimicking that, but there's no back fence, and that's exactly what I'm trying to say. This is what we're doing. So there's a front fence here, a few of the calves have gone under, but generally they're all there. The water's back to the right, back here, to the right of that, and yeah, we're just mimicking that sort of behavior, and they love it. They're very relaxed and they're happier then.
Yeah, brilliant. Is there any more
Okay,
questions
I'll
from
put more Selective. So just that question from Niels. Oh, got any more pics of Selective paddocks? I'll put some in, Niels, but with cattle, we use just a couple of hot tapes on steel posts. With sheep, sort of maybe some ring lock. So it's really, that was sort of using sheep panels in that one I showed you before. But yeah, yeah, I'll make sure to include that in the presentation when I send the notes out. So I hope what I really want to know is that what I'm trying to do is sort of say to people that I think we've got this wrong on what the current advice is. I see it as the populist view of it going round, not utilising high enough, not worrying, trying to get animal performance rather than selecting the animals that perform, and grazing below the threshold that rapidly regenerates your perennial pastures. So I'm saying, don't believe me, don't take advice from me, go and put in your safe to fail practice areas. They need to be at high density. So I've been saying a cow per 3 square meters and a sheep per square meter. It's sort of that sort of high density, because then you know you've eliminated that variable, and then you're going to get rapid regeneration. And you'll also see that that's only for 2 or 3 hours, typically on most pastures, that you do it at that density for in this little trial area, and learn. So there's a few things I see happen in Australia. People not only learn that that's what the land needs, and that builds landscape function, so that first learning loop, but they actually then learn that, oh, it's my management that's actually creating the problem that I'm worried about. So that second loop, double loop learning, where you actually go, oh, so I work with people that love that they're in charge and that it's them. And I also work with people that will run as fast as they can away from that. So you've got to be aware that once you understand this stuff, there's nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. So if we see a problem, then you know, I know it's my creation, not that Mother Nature or something's doing something to me. So from Ali, if you're understocked, it's better to rest the land for the year based on your stocking rate, or to create hay silage, etc., to earn extra capital and thus more stock. Yeah, so that's sort of as you're growing your numbers, Ali. So it could be best to do the hay and silage, as long as you then don't go and graze it after you've made the hay and silage. So if I made hay and silage, I'd then leave it to grow again and make sure that it's replaced all its root reserves. It's got fresh litter in it before you grazed it again. But when everyone's nearly understocked on the eastern seaboard after the drought, and all we do is just make the paddocks smaller, you know, in those strips. So people are never worried about, that I work with, are never worried about being understocked. They're only focusing on being overstocked. I think we've got that much going on in agriculture and the family and the business and the seasons. And, you know, it's such a complex thing. It made working for ICI in London, like I used to think I was working. I think I was kidding myself. You know, if we weren't going to make our profit, we just wrote a letter and put the price up. Do you know, like, so that was in those 80s, you know, before that recession. And, but, you know, so I was working for ICI, going up to Teesside all the time and doing all that sort of stuff. But it was pretty simple stuff compared to agriculture. So if you're understocked, we just make those paddocks smaller, slow down, which increases your landscape function. if you don't have enough money to buy more animals, then we take an investment in the land by increasing the landscape function, getting more decomposing litter, creating those conditions. So, but yeah, there may be really good, valid financial reasons to do that. Yeah, it could, Silas, but there's also, so the question is, would the need for a back fence be more prominent in the UK, having a higher rainfall and faster recovery than what is probably going on in the hotter, drier Australian and southern states US, avoiding taking the second bite on the previous few paddocks, which might come through fairly quickly. Yet I really like that you actually understand the second bite is actually that the grasses have got to have grown. You cannot take a second bite out of a plant that hasn't regrown. So overgrazing is not what the second bite. There's a lot of this confusion out here. Let me get that perennial grass recovery and slide up. This is important information. So it's when this is where you get overgrazing, because you've eaten it down. So there's nothing wrong with eating it down high utilisation. That's not a second bite. It's when the leaves come up and then you bite it again while the animals are still in the paddock. But you've got to be really clear that people don't fail from staying too long in a paddock. They fail from coming back too quick. I have never seen people fail from staying too long. You know, like when you set stocked in spring in Australia in our rapid growth, so we might be lambing and they'll all be sort of stocked in a paddock, sort of lambing on the move, sort of a PhD in agriculture. You've got to have animals that are really good at sort of looking after themselves. It's coming back. So if you eat it down and then you come back here, so if you stay too long, you might overgraze a few plants that have regrown. So you might say you overgraze 20%, 50%. If you come back too quick, you overgraze 100%. That's where the failure's from. That's what depletes root reserves. It's never staying too long. It is always coming back too quick. And, you know, like that's in a bit of conflict with what Alan would say and things, but in practice, I'm sure you can see that. Short duration grazing, even the term creates the bad behaviour because people are worried about getting them out of the paddock rather than working them really well and utilising the grass and making them, you know, work for their tucker and then shift them on based on gut fills. That will work every time. But then you've also got the other one, the stock density herd effect, that you've actually got to make sure that you're grazing at a density. And if they're grazing at densities and with those sort of designs and strip fences and stuff, you'll shift them on. So I would tell the story of our driveway ran for 1 kilometre down beside the road paddock, and sort of they'd be in strips. If all the cows were back at the water, the whole family would tell me that they'd need a move. So, you know, the kids would come in, you know, Dad, those cows need a shift. Dad, those cows need a shift. And then someone else would go, Graeme, those cows need a shift. Yeah, so the whole family knew if they were back at the water, they'd run out at the front. So we would then shift them again. So if they're drifting back and sitting at the water, you shift them forward again. But you can decide how much and how tight that is so that you've got this great flexibility. It's a lack of flexibility in the fencing design and water that is the biggest barrier for people being successful with this. And the best way is to use the idea of the water at the back, which as far as I know was one of Johan Zietzmann's, because he understood about high utilisation. It works if you have the water at the back and you don't back fence. How are we going? Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, I think I think if we don't have any more questions, we probably should call it time on that.
Sure. Yeah, hope that's been worthwhile for people. and
Yeah.
happy to take emails and questions and things like that. It sometimes takes me a while to get back, and it'll have my email. I was worried about that, but yeah, it'll have my email and everything on the notes when they go out. So if people want to just drop me a note, I do. If I can just ask, can I ask something? If you do send me an email, just ask me the question. I'm sort of getting swamped because I have to read through 3 or 4 paragraphs about people's opinion on regenerative grazing and whether they agree or not. And I go, well, is there a question in here or is it just a comment? So if you want to send me questions, send me some photos and say, oh, what do you think's going on here? Describe what's happening. That I can process that really quickly and get back to people. But and one of the things that I keep saying every time is it's easier to act your way into a new way of thinking rather than think your way into a new way of acting. So put in the safe to fail practice areas, because that will then drive the way you think about this stuff. So it's not lack of motivation or mindset or any of those things, commitment to your holistic context. It's actually getting going and doing stuff which will actually make you successful.
Perfect. Sounds good. And in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be chatting with Nicole. So.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, well, say hello. She's a mate of mine.
Yeah, she's
we
going to be talking
bump
to
into people. Last time we bumped into one another was in Albuquerque. So.
Yeah, I think she quite likes America, actually. I don't think she's that keen to go back to New Zealand.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
Very good.
Yeah.
I hope that was all right. I hope it was all right. Not too preachy. I do get a bit wound up. And really happy to help and send the materials around, and people can see if they like it or not.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much information out there right now around this sort of management process. It's really quite good to kind of get some sort of different angles on it, and it's very new and fresh in the UK. So it's good to see these sorts of principles coming across from guys that have been doing it for a long time.
Fantastic.
Perfect. Thanks, Graeme.
Thank you. Thanks all. Bye.
Ciao.